Vice President J.D. Vance leaned into the microphone and said, "Governor, I want you to meet someone." He paused just long enough for the room to tilt forward, then added, "Her name is Jennifer, and she's in the audience tonight." His voice wasn't loud, but it had that clean, surgical edge that makes a crowd stop fidgeting. For a fraction of a second, Governor Gavin Newsom went still. So fast, you'd miss it if you weren't watching for the slip. And the cameras, of course, were watching for the slip. The stage lights at the CN Town Hall in Los Angeles were the kind that don't flatter anybody, not even people who live for television. Let's say it was October 23, 2025, and CNN had branded it a California Crisis Forum because dramatic nouns sell better than complicated explanations. The premise was simple. California's problems were loud, visible, and impossible to ignore, and Newsom had agreed to face critics on live TV. He expected hard questions, sure, and probably a few sharp clips for social media later. What he didn't expect, at least not in this exact shape, was the Vice President of the United States standing across from him like a cross-examiner with a clock. For 2 hours, the exchange had looked like one of those fights where both sides think they're winning because they're both talking. Newsom framed California as a big, stubborn experiment, messy, ambitious, still worth believing in. Vance framed it as a scoreboard, numbers, trends, receipts, and the kind of rhetorical finger-pointing that tries to make math feel like morality. In that setup, the audience becomes a jury, and the moderator becomes a traffic cop. But the moment Jennifer stood up, the whole thing shifted from policy theater into something that felt like a human interruption. CNN's moderator, Dana Bash, glanced down at her notes with the expression of someone realizing the script had just been mugged in a dark alley. This wasn't the tidy part where a voter asks about gas prices and the candidate says, "I hear you." This was the part where a person's life walks onto the stage and refuses to behave like a talking point. The camera found Jennifer in the audience, row 7, left side, because cameras always find the story when it starts to breathe. She rose slowly, and the room got quiet in that uncomfortable way, like the building itself was holding its breath. Jennifer looked like someone who had learned how to be small in public to avoid becoming a target. She was in her early 50s, thin in a way that didn't read as wellness, but as missing meals. Her clothes were clean but tired, the way fabric looks when it has done too many hard days. Her hands shook slightly as she held the mic, not theatrical, not performative, just human. And the strangest detail was how calm her face became once she started speaking, as if the fear had already been used up. "Governor Gavin Newsom," she said, and her voice sounded like it had been through a lot of late nights and not enough sleep. "You don't know me, but I know you." She said she used to live a few blocks from where he lived in San Francisco, in the kind of neighborhood people use as shorthand for protected. Newsom's expression shifted into the familiar empathy mask, head tilt, softened eyes, the practiced tone that signals, "I'm listening." It was the look politicians wear like a seatbelt, not proof of safety, but a promise they won't get thrown through the windshield. "I was a teacher," Jennifer said, and that one sentence landed heavier than most of the numbers on the screen that night. She said she taught 5th grade in the Sunset District and did it for 17 years. She talked about loving her students, the kind of love that shows up early, stays late, and still buys pencils out of pocket. Then she moved into the years that everybody remembers, but nobody remembers the same way. 2020, 2021, 2022, like a timeline made of broken routines. She said she was furloughed during the COVID era, then later laid off, and eventually the math stopped working. She said unemployment wasn't enough to hold the rent line in San Francisco. She said she burned through savings the way a candle burns through oxygen, quietly, inevitably, and with a smell you only notice when it's too late. She said she lost her apartment and ended up sleeping outside, and the room stayed silent because even jaded audiences still know what it means when someone says that out loud. The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere a phone buzzed on, silent. The lights stayed harsh and indifferent. And that's the thing about television. It can turn pain into content without changing the lighting. Jennifer said she had been homeless in San Francisco for 3.5 years. Not off and on, not down on her luck, not between places, but sleeping outside homeless. She said she tried shelters, and sometimes they were full, sometimes they were dangerous, sometimes they were both on the same night. She said she called hotlines, filled out applications, and kept hearing about waiting lists that stretched into years. She described the kind of routine that never makes it into glossy policy brochures. Doorways, backpacks, constant vigilance, and the feeling of being disposable. She said she'd been beaten twice and robbed more times than she could count without pausing to do the inventory of her own losses. She said she got pneumonia last winter and came close enough to dying that it stopped being a metaphor. Then she looked directly at Newsom and said something that made the room stiffen. "And you walked past me," she said, not once, but twice. Not, "I think it was you," not, "someone who looked like you," but a claim delivered with the confidence of a person who has replayed the memory until it became sharp. She described a night on a street near his neighborhood, and she gave details, street name, month, the approximate time, like she was building a case out of memory because memory was all she had. She said he came out dressed up, talking on the phone, and for a second their eyes met. She said it wasn't a long moment, just a glance, and then he stepped around her and kept moving. If you've ever watched someone in power step around suffering the way you step around a puddle, you know how little time it takes to communicate a lot. And you could feel the audience trying to decide whether the most painful part was the walking past or the fact that it sounded so plausible. Then she described a second sighting near Napa, near the French Laundry, the restaurant that has become a cultural shorthand for expensive taste and bad optics. She said she was on the sidewalk, waiting, hoping there was a shelter option that turned out not to exist. She said she saw Newsom with a group, dressed up, laughing, heading inside. She said she later looked up the price range and did the math that poor people learn to do instinctively. Cost per person, number of people, the rough total. The number mattered less than the contrast, but the contrast is exactly what numbers are built for. At that point, Vance let the silence sit there like a weight. Then he spoke in a calmer voice, like a narrator stepping back into a documentary after a witness finishes talking. He called Jennifer a face for the broader crisis, and he referenced statewide homelessness totals and a big headline figure about spending. Here's where careful language matters. You can cite spending and you can cite counts, but you can't force them to behave like a confession. So he did what politicians do best. He turned the moment into a question for the audience to answer in their own heads. What does it mean, he implied, when a state spends huge sums and a former teacher still sleeps in doorways? Vance framed it as accountability. Newsom framed it as exploitation, calling it ambush politics, and suggesting Jennifer was being used as a prop. That's a familiar argument, too. If the story hurts, attack the delivery system. But Jennifer didn't look like a prop. She looked like someone who had been carrying the same story long before anyone handed her a microphone. And the audience, whatever their politics, seemed to feel the same unease. If this is a prop, why does it feel so real? Newsom turned to Jennifer and offered sympathy, but he also tried to set a boundary. He said he couldn't be expected to personally recognize and solve every individual situation. That line, on television, is the kind of sentence that sounds reasonable in a staff memo and catastrophic in a human moment. Because nobody was asking him to be a superhero. They were asking him to be a person who doesn't step over suffering like it's inconvenient street furniture. And you could almost hear the audience thinking, was that the best way to say that? Was that the only way he could say that? Vance didn't have to shout to make the contrast sharper. He talked about expectations, basic decency, basic alignment between rhetoric and reality, basic awareness of the optics you create when you govern in comfort. He argued that leadership isn't just spreadsheets and press conferences, it's the posture you take toward the people your policies touch. And then he turned it outward, toward the cameras, toward everyone watching at home, because that's how these moments become bigger than the room. When politics becomes a morality play, the audience doesn't just listen, they cast roles. Now, if you back up earlier in the night, before Jennifer stood, this was already being staged as a clash of narratives. Newsom came out with the language of big systems, innovation, leadership, values, investment, the idea that California is a country inside a state. Vance came out with the language of outcomes, residents leaving, costs rising, faith thinning out, the feeling that the story doesn't match the street. One style says, we're building something. The other says, show me the results. And if you've watched American politics long enough, you know that results is often code for, I don't believe you anymore. In the imagined backstage version of this, Newsom's team would be coaching tone and framing. Stay optimistic. Don't get rattled. Don't let the other guy drag you into the mud. Vance's team, in that same imagined space, would be arranging binders and timelines like it was trial prep. Not because binders are magic, but because paper creates the illusion of inevitability. The point of receipts is less about truth than about confidence. If you look certain enough, the audience starts borrowing your certainty. And when a politician looks uncertain, the audience starts charging interest. What made Jennifer's appearance hit wasn't just the content of her story, it was the way it collapsed distance. You can argue about the homeless population forever and never picture a face. You can debate billions and never picture a doorway. But the second a person says, I slept on your street, the abstract becomes uncomfortably specific. And that specificity is kryptonite to the smooth, safe language politicians use to survive. There's also a darker question beneath it, one that doesn't need anyone to say the word guilty. If Jennifer is telling the truth, what does that say about the gap between leadership branding and lived reality? And if Jennifer is mistaken, if she's confusing faces, dates, places, what does it say that the story still feels believable to so many people watching? Why does it feel plausible that a powerful man could step around a homeless woman and never store the moment in his memory? Is it because it happens? Or because we've all seen versions of it? Or because we've come to expect a certain numbness from people at the top? This is where the commentary becomes personal, not because I know these people, but because I know the country that produces these scenes. America doesn't just argue about policy, it argues about who gets seen. And being unseen is its own kind of poverty, a poverty that often shows up before the financial one does. When a former teacher says she became invisible, she's talking about more than money. She's talking about status, safety, and the slow erosion of dignity. That's why a moment like this cuts through. It's not just a debate. It's an accusation of indifference. And indifference is the one sin nobody can spin into leadership. If you're trying to write this as a tense, voice-over-friendly political narrative without turning it into a direct indictment, the key is to keep everything inside the frame of perception. What did it look like? How did it land? Why did the audience react the way they did? You can let the viewer do the judging without telling them what to think. You can say, Here's what was said, and then ask, what would you have said? And you can keep returning to the uncomfortable center. The point isn't whether a politician can recite a plan. The point is whether the plan is reaching the people it was built for. By the end of the night, the room felt less like a forum and more like a mirror. Newsom looked like a man trying to find the right sentence after the moment had already moved on without him. Vance looked like a man who understood that television isn't about the best argument. It's about the cleanest contrast. Jennifer looked like someone who didn't come to be famous, but who also wasn't willing to be quiet anymore. And the audience looked like they had just watched the collision between two Californias, the one that lives behind gates and the one that sleeps near them. If this were the kind of moment that lives online afterward, and moments like this always do, the viral engine wouldn't care about nuance. It would care about the clip where Newsom tries to draw a boundary, and it would care about the reaction shot on Jennifer's face. It would care about the pause, the stumble, the seconds where the mask slips and the person underneath looks briefly exposed. Because that's what the public is hungry for now. Not perfection, not even competence, but authenticity, or at least the appearance of it. And once a politician is framed as disconnected, every expensive dinner, every polished soundbite, every rehearsed smile starts to look like evidence in a story the audience has already decided is true. So the question that lingers isn't who won the debate, because that's the cheap question. The question is, why do we keep building systems that can spend enormous sums and still leave a teacher sleeping outside? Is the money trapped in bureaucracy, or is the problem bigger than funding? Or is the political incentive simply stronger to manage crises than to end them? And if the public is watching these scenes like entertainment, what does that do to the people who show up as the human moment in the middle of the show? Are we helping them by listening, or are we consuming them the way we consume everything else? That's the tension you can ride from first line to last. Not a verdict, but a discomfort. Keep the language grounded. What was seen, what was said, how it sounded, how it played in the room. Use questions like a metronome to keep the viewer leaning forward. Let irony show up in small doses, the perfect hair under harsh lights, the scripted empathy against unscripted pain. The way numbers can sound like compassion until a person stands up and says, they never saw any of it. And if you want to be safe while still being sharp, anchor everything in perspective. In my view, the optics were devastating. To me, the silence said more than any speech. I can't prove what anyone felt, but I can tell you what it looked like. But the answers, even when measured and careful, landed on an audience that had already crossed an emotional border. When people stop listening for solutions and start listening for sincerity, every phrase gets weighed differently. And sincerity, once questioned, is almost impossible to restore in real time. Newsom spoke about complexity, about scale, about the difficulty of governing a state that functions like a small nation. Those are all reasonable points in isolation, and they've worked for him before, especially with audiences inclined to grant benefit of the doubt. Yet, after Jennifer's story, the language sounded less like explanation and more like insulation. Not wrong, necessarily, but distant, like hearing about climate patterns while standing in the rain. It raised an uncomfortable question that no one said out loud, but many were thinking, when does explanation start to feel like avoidance? Vance, for his part, didn't press the attack so much as let the contrast speak for itself. He slowed down, lowered his voice, and leaned into the rhythm of someone who knows the cameras are already doing the work. Instead of adding new claims, he reframed old ones as open-ended doubts. If the money was spent, where did it show up? If the programs worked, why did the line keep growing? What made that approach effective wasn't aggression, but patience. He let the audience connect dots rather than drawing lines for them. That's a subtle difference, but it matters, especially when viewers are allergic to being told what to think. Questions linger longer than accusations, and doubt travels farther than certainty. In that sense, the night wasn't about winning a debate, but about planting a suspicion. Jennifer sat back down quietly, and that image carried its own weight. She didn't raise her fist, didn't shout, didn't demand anything dramatic. She simply returned to her seat, like someone who had said what needed to be said, and understood that the rest was out of her hands. That restraint made her harder to dismiss, not easier. It also made the moment feel less like theater and more like interruption. As the closing statements approached, the studio felt smaller. The applause cues were uneven, hesitant, as if people weren't sure what reaction was appropriate anymore. Newsom's final remarks leaned into resolve and recommitment, the promise of continued effort and better outcomes ahead. He sounded like someone aware that the night had not gone as planned, but determined not to concede the frame. Yet, resolve without acknowledgement can read as stubbornness, and recommitment without reckoning can sound hollow. Vance's closing, by contrast, avoided triumph. He didn't declare victory or forecast consequences. He simply returned to the theme of alignment. Do leaders live by the same reality as the people affected by their decisions? Or do they experience a buffered version of it? That question doesn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but it does invite comparison. And comparison, in politics, is often more damaging than direct criticism. When the cameras finally cut, the room stayed quiet longer than usual. Staffers moved quickly, but the energy lagged behind them, heavy and unresolved. Newsom left the stage without the usual casual exchanges, surrounded immediately by aides who spoke in low, urgent tones. Vance lingered just long enough to shake hands with the moderator, his expression unreadable. Jennifer exited with the audience, not escorted, not spotlighted, blending back into the crowd she came from. Outside the studio, the night air felt cooler, sharper, like Los Angeles after a marine layer rolls in. Phones were already lighting up, clips uploading, captions being written in real time by people who knew exactly which 10 seconds would travel farthest. The line about not being able to solve every individual problem began circulating almost immediately, stripped of context and amplified by repetition. That's how moments harden into symbols, regardless of intent. Once that happens, explanation becomes secondary to perception. Over the next hours, commentary bloomed across the media landscape, each outlet projecting its own priorities onto the same footage. Some framed it as a necessary reckoning, others as a political ambush, others as a tragic misunderstanding magnified by television. What was striking was how little disagreement there was about the emotional impact, even among people who disagreed about everything else. Most acknowledged that something had shifted, though they differed on what it meant. And meaning, in politics, is always contested terrain. Poll numbers, pundit chatter, donor whispers, all of that would come later, and none of it could fully explain the discomfort the night left behind. Because what lingered wasn't a policy argument, but a feeling. The feeling that governance, at scale, can drift so far from individual experience that it stops recognizing its own reflection. The feeling that empathy, when practiced too often as performance, risks becoming indistinguishable from habit. And the feeling that once people sense that gap, they stop listening the way they used to. It's tempting to turn moments like this into morality plays with clear heroes and villains. That temptation should probably be resisted, if only because real systems rarely collapse into simple stories. But it's also hard to ignore how one person's account can puncture layers of messaging in a way white papers never do. Jennifer didn't present a solution or a demand. She presented a lived contradiction. And contradictions are harder to manage than critics. If you zoom out far enough, this wasn't just about Gavin Newsom or J.D. Vance. It was about the uneasy relationship between power and proximity, between decision-makers and the consequences of those decisions. It was about what happens when success insulates leaders from the outcomes they're tasked with fixing. And it was about how quickly public patience evaporates when compassion sounds rehearsed. None of that requires assuming bad intent. It only requires acknowledging human distance. The final image many viewers carried with them wasn't a statistic or a chart. It was a woman standing under studio lights, saying she felt seen for 1 second, and then stepped around. Whether that memory was accurate in every detail almost became beside the point. What mattered was that millions of people recognized the scenario instantly. They'd seen it before, in different forms, in different cities, often without cameras. That recognition is what makes moments like this dangerous for politicians, not because they prove something definitively, but because they resonate emotionally before facts can catch up. Once resonance sets in, rebuttals sound technical, and technical language rarely wins against personal narrative. This isn't fair, but politics has never promised fairness. It promises attention. And attention, once captured, doesn't easily return to spreadsheets. In the days that followed, analysts would debate strategy, messaging, and missteps. They would ask whether Newsom should have responded differently, whether Vance crossed an ethical line, whether CNN should have structured the forum another way. All valid questions, all safely abstract. But the harder question sat underneath all of them. Why did this feel inevitable? Why did it feel like a moment waiting for a stage rather than a surprise? Maybe it's because trust has become so fragile that people are primed to believe disconnection before competence. Maybe it's because the scale of modern governance makes genuine intimacy between leaders and constituents almost impossible. Or maybe it's because, after years of polished language, people are craving evidence that someone, somewhere, actually notices the human cost. Those are uncomfortable possibilities, and none of them point to easy fixes. But they do suggest that the old playbook, more money, better messaging, tighter framing, might not be enough anymore. In that sense, the forum didn't end with answers. It ended with unease. Unease about how problems are discussed versus how they're lived. Unease about whether intention matters as much as outcome. Unease about how often the people most affected are invited into the conversation only after the cameras are rolling. And unease, finally, about what happens next when the lights turn off and the street is still cold. If this story works as long-form political commentary, it's because it resists closure. There's no neat resolution, no decisive verdict, no final statistic that settles the argument. There's only a moment, replayed and reframed, asking the same question from different angles. What does leadership look like when stripped of distance and decorum? And how many more Jennifers are out there, unseen, waiting for someone to answer without deflecting? What ultimately makes a night like that linger isn't the sound of voices raised or the sharpness of any single exchange, but the quiet realization that something familiar has stopped working. Politics has always relied on distance, on abstraction, on the idea that large systems can be discussed without dwelling too long on the individuals caught inside them. That distance is what allows leaders to speak in averages, trends, and projections without collapsing under the emotional weight of every consequence. But distance, once exposed, starts to look less like necessity and more like avoidance. And when viewers sense that shift, they don't need to be told how to feel. They feel it on their own. For years, California's struggles have been debated as if they were philosophical disagreements rather than lived conditions. Is homelessness a housing issue or a mental health issue? Is crime a data problem or a perception problem? Is affordability about supply, demand, regulation, or values? These questions fill panels and reports, and they matter. But they also create a buffer between cause and effect. Jennifer's presence punctured that buffer, not by offering answers, but by standing in the space where answers were supposed to land. It's worth saying plainly that no single governor, vice president, or legislature can personally absorb the suffering of millions without becoming paralyzed. That isn't a moral failing. It's a structural reality. Governance at scale requires delegation, systems, and layers of removal, or it collapses under its own weight. The problem begins when those layers become so thick that leaders stop recognizing when their language no longer connects to experience. At that point, even well-intended explanations start to sound like excuses. What viewers saw that night was not proof of malice or proof of corruption. It was something subtler and, in some ways, more unsettling. It looked like a man accustomed to speaking about problems who suddenly found himself confronted by a person who embodied one. It looked like a moment where preparation met unpredictability and couldn't adapt fast enough. And it looked like an audience realizing that empathy, when over-rehearsed, can lose its elasticity. That's why the sentence about not being able to solve every individual problem landed the way it did. In another context, another room, another night, it might have passed unnoticed. Most people understand that leaders can't fix everything personally, and most would agree with that statement in theory. But theory collapses under proximity, and proximity is what Jennifer brought with her. Once that collapse happens, language stops being evaluated for accuracy and starts being evaluated for tone. Tone in modern politics is often destiny. Voters forgive mistakes, inconsistencies, even contradictions, as long as they believe they're being seen and respected. They become unforgiving when they feel dismissed, even accidentally. That's not a partisan trait, it's a human one. People don't need perfection from leaders, but they do need recognition that their pain isn't just a statistic to be managed. The irony is that this is precisely the kind of moment many politicians fear, yet also the kind they can't entirely avoid. Large-scale problems eventually produce small-scale stories, and small-scale stories eventually find microphones. You can delay that collision with messaging and strategy, but you can't eliminate it. When it finally happens, the reaction isn't just about the facts presented, but about whether the leader appears capable of absorbing the moment without deflecting it. That's a skill no briefing book can fully teach. For viewers watching at home, the forum likely didn't resolve their opinions so much as sharpen them. Supporters of Newsom may have felt the moment was unfair, overly theatrical, or designed to embarrass rather than inform. Critics likely felt vindicated, seeing in Jennifer's story a confirmation of doubts they already held. But the largest group, the quiet middle that doesn't tweet in real time, probably felt something harder to articulate. A sense that the conversation they were watching didn't quite match the lives they were living. That mismatch is dangerous terrain for any political figure, regardless of ideology. Once people begin to suspect that leaders are operating in a different reality, every subsequent message is filtered through skepticism. Promises sound provisional. Success stories sound curated. Even genuine efforts risk being dismissed as optics. Trust, once cracked, doesn't shatter loudly. It erodes silently. What makes this especially challenging is that there's no obvious corrective script. You can't apologize your way out of structural failure, but you also can't spreadsheet your way back into emotional credibility. You can announce reforms, audits, task forces, and timelines, and they may even be meaningful. Yet if the public feels those measures are responses to embarrassment rather than to need, the cynicism only deepens. The order matters, and the sequence is rarely forgiving. Jennifer's story didn't offer a policy roadmap, and that's precisely why it mattered. It wasn't trying to compete with experts or economists. It wasn't asking to be scaled or replicated. It simply asked a question by existing. How does this happen in a place that claims to care so much? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It demands reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable in a political culture that rewards speed and certainty. If there's a lesson here, it may be less about ideology and more about proximity. Leaders who remain physically and socially distant from the consequences of their policies inevitably develop blind spots. Those blind spots aren't proof of bad character, but they do shape decision-making. Over time, they create a gap between intention and impact that widens quietly until someone falls into it on live television. Closing that gap requires more than better messaging. It requires different habits of attention. The audience reaction that night suggested a hunger for something that's been missing for a while. Not outrage, not vengeance, not even dramatic accountability, but acknowledgement without defensiveness. A willingness to sit in discomfort without immediately reframing it. A recognition that sometimes the right response isn't explanation, but listening that doesn't rush toward resolution. That kind of patience is rare, especially under studio lights and time constraints. As the clips continue to circulate and the commentary continues to stack, it's likely the specifics will blur. Dates, numbers, and context will be debated endlessly, often by people who weren't in the room. But the emotional imprint will remain, because emotion travels farther than detail. People will remember how it felt to watch that exchange more than what was said word for word. And feelings, once established, are stubborn things. In the end, this wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense. There were no secret recordings, no sudden revelations, no smoking gun documents dropped on a desk. It was simply a moment where a narrative met resistance from lived experience and didn't fully recover. Those moments don't end careers on their own, but they do alter trajectories. They change how future statements are heard and how past ones are reinterpreted. For anyone watching closely, the deeper question lingers long after the broadcast fades. How many policies are evaluated primarily by how they sound rather than how they land? How often do leaders mistake scale for success, assuming that big numbers must translate into real relief somewhere? And how many people like Jennifer exist at the margins of these debates, unseen until a camera finds them? Those questions don't accuse, they invite examination. Political systems are built to process votes, budgets, and legislation, not dignity. Dignity enters the picture only when someone insists on it, often at personal risk. That insistence can be inconvenient, disruptive, and impossible to schedule neatly into a rundown. But without it, politics becomes a closed loop of professionals talking to each other about problems they no longer feel. Jennifer's interruption reminded viewers of that gap, whether they wanted to be reminded or not. The forum ended, the lights dimmed, and everyone went back to their roles. Newsom returned to governing, Vance returned to national politics. The network moved on to the next story. Jennifer returned to a life that, for all the attention it briefly received, remained uncertain and fragile. That imbalance is uncomfortable, but it's also honest. Television can amplify a voice, but it can't guarantee an outcome. What remains is the image of a conversation that slipped out of control just long enough to reveal something raw. Not a verdict, not a confession, but a fracture in the usual rhythm. Moments like that don't resolve anything on their own, but they do mark a before and after. Afterward, it becomes harder to speak only in abstractions without someone somewhere thinking of a face. And that, quietly, may be the most consequential part of the entire night.